Ladies and gentlemen, respected colleagues, policymakers, and all those who are deeply invested in the shifting balance of global geopolitics, I stand before you today to address an issue that has often been misunderstood, sometimes deliberately misinterpreted and occasionally oversimplified: the nature of India-China relations, and the frequent assumption that these relations are merely a byproduct of India's growing engagement with the United States. This assumption that India's relationship with China is determined by its ties with the United States is not only inaccurate, but it undermines the principles of sovereignty and strategic autonomy that India has carefully nurtured since its independence in 1947. India and China, two of the world's oldest civilizations and now two of the largest modern economies, share a history and a border that predates the very idea of U.S. involvement in Asian geopolitics. Their relationship is shaped by geography, history, security concerns, trade interests, and the aspirations of their people. To suggest that it is defined by Washington or determined by the U.S.-India dynamic is to misunderstand the very essence of Asian geopolitics in the 21st century. Today, I will speak about why India's relationship with China is independent of U.S. influence, why New Delhi insists on separating its China policy from Washington's agenda, and how this approach is shaping the broader Indo-Pacific order. To understand why India's relations with China stand on their own, we must look at history. Long before the United States emerged as a global power, India and China had already developed cultural and commercial linkages. The Silk Road carried not just goods but also ideas, philosophies, and spiritual traditions between these two civilizations. In modern times, India was one of the first non-communist countries to recognize the People's Republic of China in 1950. The two nations coined the slogan, Hindi Chini, Bye Bye. Indians and Chinese are brothers during the early years of their diplomatic engagement. But history also reminds us of tension. The 1962 border war, unresolved territorial disputes, and frequent military standoffs, such as Do Klem in 2017 and Gawan in 2020, have created deep mistrust. These conflicts are not a result of India's relationship with Washington, but of issues that are strictly bilateral: borders, sovereignty, and security. Thus, the foundation of India-China relations is bilateral and independent, shaped by the weight of geography and history, not by external alliances. Let us acknowledge a reality: the rise of the United States in Asia, particularly since the end of the Cold War, has influenced how India and China interact with each other. Washington has often sought to bring India closer as a counterweight to China, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. Indeed, platforms like the Quad, which includes India, the US, Japan, and Australia, are often portrayed as anti-China initiatives. Washington also actively courts New Delhi through defense agreements, technology transfers, and trade partnerships. But influence is not determination. India is not, and has never been, a client state of any global power. As External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar recently emphasized, India's relationship with China is not determined by our ties with the United States. This reflects New Delhi's firm belief in strategic autonomy. India engages with the U.S. because it serves its national interest in technology, defense modernization, and global positioning. But when it comes to China, India's choices are guided by what happens on the Himalayan borders, the Indian Ocean, and within Asia itself, not by Washington's calculus. To truly understand why India's China policy is independent, we must examine the core issues at stake: border disputes. The line of actual control stretches over 3,488 kilometers. Military standoffs, patrol clashes, and the lack of a formal boundary settlement make this the single biggest driver of mistrust. The Galwan clashes of June 2020, where Indian soldiers made the ultimate sacrifice, are proof that India's China challenge is about sovereignty, not America. Trade imbalances. China is one of India's largest trading partners. with bilateral trade crossing $135 billion in 2023 to 24. Yet the imbalance with India, importing far more than it exports, is a domestic economic concern. Whether or not the U.S. is involved, India must address this challenge bilaterally with China. Regional influence. India and China both seek influence in South Asia and the Indian Ocean. China's Belt and Road Initiative (BRI), its presence in Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and Nepal, and its growing naval capabilities directly impact India's neighborhood. These are regional issues. They exist irrespective of Washington's presence. Multilateral forums. India and China often collaborate in BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization (SCO), and G20, but they also compete for leadership of the Global South. This dynamic is independent of U.S. relations. It is a direct contest for influence in Asia, Africa, and beyond. India's foreign policy doctrine has consistently been one of known alignment, later redefined as multi-alignment. From Nehru's known-aligned movement to today's concept of strategic autonomy, India's goal has been clear: build relations with major powers. But never let those relations dictate New Delhi's sovereignty or decision-making. This principle guides India's China policy. For example, India is a member of the Quad, but it is also an active player in BRICS alongside China and Russia. India buys advanced defense technology from the U.S., but it also buys oil and weapons from Russia. India shares democratic values with Washington, but it maintains economic interdependence with Beijing. This balancing act shows that India refuses to let its U.S. relationship dictate its China policy. New Delhi decides independently where to cooperate with Beijing, such as in climate change, or BRICS, and where to confront it, such as on the border. There are three key reasons why India insists on separating its China policy from U.S. ties. Geography cannot be escaped. India and China are neighbors. The U.S. is an ocean away. No matter how close India becomes to Washington, it cannot change the fact that Beijing is right across the Himalayas. National interests must prevail. India's core concerns: border security, regional stability, trade imbalances, are not Washington's problems. They are India's problems, and only India can solve them. Global image of independence. If India allows its China policy to be seen as Washington-driven, it would lose credibility as a leader of the Global South. Countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America respect India precisely because it maintains independence in its choices. The future of India-China relations looking ahead. India-China relations will remain competitive, cautious, and complex. Cooperation in multilateral forums will continue. Economic engagement will be pragmatic. But border tensions and regional rivalry will persist. The role of the United States will remain important, but not determinant. Washington will continue to court India. But New Delhi will ensure that its decisions vis China are made in New Delhi, not in Washington. D.C., in other words, India will walk with the U.S. when interests align, but it will stand alone when interests diverge. Let me conclude with this thought. India's relationship with China is one of the most consequential of the 21st century. It is a relationship that will shape Asia's future, influence the Indo-Pacific order, and impact the balance of power between East and West. But this relationship, rooted in history, geography, rivalry, and cooperation, is India's to manage, not Washington's to dictate. Yes, India and the U.S. share a strategic partnership. Yes, they may coordinate in areas where China is a challenge. But to assume that India's China policy is merely a reflection of its U.S. ties is to misunderstand India's identity. India is not a pawn on someone else's chessboard. It is a player in its own right, sovereign, independent, and determined to pursue its national interests with an open mind, but firm red lines. The world must recognize this reality. India-China relations are bilateral, complex, and determined by New Delhi and Beijing alone. Thank you.